don't want to cover this. Right? See, if you want a really satisfying story from gaming's past, you'd have to go a really long way to beat one in which Chris Sawyer, he cuts his teeth writing some solid and playable games for the Memotech MTX. He pays his dues and built his skills porting existing games to the PC. You know, that's straight up training montage fodder there. And then he uses this sort of near otherworldly talent he's built up for optimization and x86 assembler to create one of the greatest transport games and one of the greatest roller coaster games of all time, each with its own well-regarded sequel. You know, in story terms, you'd end it there, wouldn't you? As Chris Sawyer roller coasters off into the sunset on his way to spend some of those royalties racking up hundreds of roller coaster credits. You wouldn't have him roller coaster back into the station shortly afterward to go, and another thing, probably not in that voice, probably something much more Scottish, while handing us all a rather dated looking transport game. Yeah, well, I mean, he would end up roller coasting back. Well, that's how roller coasters work. They come back to the station, that they load more guests, unless something has gone very, very badly wrong. You know, well, you usually don't program yourself an entire management game on the way round, though, unless there's a very slow lift hill along the way. So yeah, Locomotion exists. I think. That's a physical object. I didn't make it up. It's not AI. Yeah, Chris Sawyer's Locomotion, to give it its full title, it's a very 6 out of 10 game. I'm sure there's rave reviews on the back. Actually, no, there really isn't. There's no rave reviews on it. It's just from the the creator of Roller Coaster Tycoon. So yeah, it's a very 6 out of 10 game. And I don't just mean in the sense that the average professional review score hovers somewhere around 59%. I mean it in the sense that a genuine 6 out of 10 game is rarely 6 out of 10 throughout. Because games which are tolerably average all the way through with nothing nice to say about them have a score reserved for them, and that score is 73%. Not apologising, not explaining. Go watch Yesterday. See, a classic 6 out of 10 game is about half, I love this, and half, what the hell were you thinking? God, I'm going to get comments about that quote-unquote acting, aren't I? But is that fair a little over 2 decades later? You know, how much of 2004's what the hell were they thinking is actually, hang on, what the hell was 2004 thinking? You know, this is a year where the top grossing film was, and hang on a moment, let's just look this up. Yeah, not in that book, honestly. Yeah, the top grossing film was Shrek 2. The best British group at the Brit Awards was The Darkness. Hey, you do you, 2004. You've got a thing going on there, and I kind of respect it. Now, the major complaint that reviewers had back in 2004 was that Locomotion looked like it barely belonged in the era of Shrek 1, let alone 3 years later. A month earlier, Doom 3 had come along and made us all look up from I Believe in a Thing Called Love to see real-time per-pixel lighting. Management games, yeah, they had their more complex and freeform environments, and they were a little behind this, but Frontier were readying Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 for a November release, and it looked like this. The Sims would make its leap to 3D the same month that Locomotion came out. You know, that was the accepted standard for games at the time. As Chris Sawyer himself would admit in later interviews, the games moved on, and I didn't. And I guess that's what a lot of us head back to these old games for, so I'm not going to complain that Locomotion has no obvious graphical enhancements in the engine over Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 from back in 1999. What I am going to complain about is, to me, on that important first glance, it looked worse. A Locomotion goes for a realistic look. You know, it builds on that Roller Coaster Tycoon approach of mixing pre-rendered objects with hand-painted tiles. Except nothing that worked so well with RCT's bright colours and bold shapes. It looks grainy and bit-crushed here, with some of those large industry sprites coming across a bit under-modelled, like something out of early 90s home ray tracing. Now, in later interviews, Sawyer has suggested that Atari's support for Locomotion was not the best. And that's underlined by this releasing with an almost budget title initial price as low as £15 in some shops. And while that complaint Sawyer had about support was in the context of post-release marketing, there is the open question of how much of this look is really down to time or budget constraints when it came to, how much effort Simon Foster could put into the artwork. Given Doom 3, as mentioned, has just ended the useful life of a whole generation of graphics cards that had been considered powerful top-of-the-range models when this graphics engine was first created, I always think it was a bit of a lost opportunity that Locomotion didn't at least use 16-bit colour to make things look a little less grainy and muddy. But perhaps that might have further worsened my real problem here, had it been, shinier, more polished, less bitty. See, my ultimate conclusion on why Transport Tycoon has been so enduring is two things: charm and scale. There's an immediate appeal to the bright, chunky graphics, which makes you want to connect those idyllic towns and all those industries bustling away with intricately detailed animations. But as you do, you realise there's a scale to this world too. You can build huge map-spanning routes, 4-track main lines in busy sections, and have a network that feels epic. Yeah, just epic. You need OpenTTD for Legendary. That takes serious pathfinding. A Roller Coaster Tycoon also has that charm and scale in slightly different ways. The fun stall designs, or the little guest details, such as the way they jump up and down in the maze or take photos of particularly exciting rides. But it also perfects scale, and this time it's by bringing things in and constraining them. Building a huge roller coaster, particularly in the first game, feels like an undertaking. You need to plan how to fit it around your other rides and then weave paths and shops around it afterwards. There's never a point when a park is so big or sprawling that you don't recognise every corner of it or find some way to tweak that corner to make it slightly better. And that's the perfect scale for building a theme park, which you might have one miniature railway and maybe, if you're feeling fancy, a monorail, each of which, only has a couple of stations, unless you're making a truly gigantic endgame park. You've guessed where this is going, haven't you? Chris Sawyer's Locomotion inherits the graphics engine from Roller Coaster Tycoon and therefore also has Roller Coaster Tycoon's scale. So we've eradicated a lot of the charm with those rather dull and functional graphics, and now we break the other half of the equation. It's a game which needs to operate on charm and scale, but all it can offer you is quark and strangeness. The British Isles map you revisit multiple times throughout the game it's a painful example of this. It's got this one-street London and barely room to lay a few tiles of rail away from one town before you need to build a station for the next. And speaking of rail, this also inherits Roller Coaster Tycoon's track-laying interface, and if you remember how clunky trying to continue an existing path could get in that game, then Locomotion has some treats for you! By treat, I mean horrible experiences. And just in case that sarcasm isn't clear, it only gets worse when you start trying to add signals, and with that being so willfully obstructive, you will soon discover the only thing worse than trying to add signals in Locomotion is trying to remove them. I know, playing Transport Tycoon Deluxe without all the OpenTTD interface improvements it's a bit on the clicky side, but this is downright hostile. These three problems often come up in reviews of the time, and that's good, right? Not good for Chris Sawyer, but good for me. Yeah, we've hit my three major gripes of Locomotion in decent time. We've verified that I'm not alone in that, and I can finish off by saying that while I played hundreds of hours of Transport Tycoon Deluxe and hundreds of hours of Roller Coaster Tycoon, when it came to Chris Sawyer's Locomotion, I wish I hadn't dropped that on the floor quite so violently. Yeah, the number of hours that I spent in this was flipping hundreds. I lost them years ago, right, to a soundtrack of clicking bearings, but I used to have a huge pile of save games and custom scenarios. I had so many add-on trains downloaded, I couldn't use all of them in a single game and had to choose my region and era carefully before starting. And I downloaded the company editor from the official website and put my own face in the game, even if, as long-time viewers will know, this application requires approximately 6 more expressions than my entire acting range. Because Locomotion When it is working right, when you are looking at a mountain pass full of cliffs and curved viaducts and tunnels with trains winding through all of that, it's an incredible model railway. Being able to zoom in and see that little bit more detail, having different radii of curves and trains with enough rotation sprites to follow them smoothly, it adds so much to the experience that maybe you can forgive things being brown and the buildings looking a little bit sort of slapdash. Now, I know that YouTube is full of people saying things for dramatic effect and trying to elevate. It's a bit of a 6 out of 10 game, but I quite like the way the trains move into something a little bit more impactful and engaging. It's probably going to trigger that, this is just totally fake. But in reference to that, this is my OpenTTD train set. I was so obsessed with the idea of getting trains to move the way they did in Locomotion without also having to endure gameplay that handled like a broken wheelbarrow, that I spent hours, hundreds of hours, reading old forum posts from people who had put together proof of concepts with multiple turning angles, figured out visual bugs, which really I wouldn't have needed to figure out had I read those forum posts properly. I wrote myself an entire workflow to allow me to make multiple angles of sprites despite having near zero pixel art talent. And then when I realised that all of this broke the game if you had more than 200 trains on a map, went to the OpenTTD code itself, somehow found a way to unlock more performance in the sprite renderer. Yeah, I quite like the way the trains move in this game. Mentioning OpenTTD, that itself saw its first public release earlier in 2004, and while it wasn't the enormous feature-laden game it is today, it was already well in development by September and starting to accumulate some of the mini features of TTD patch. And this was another problem that Locomotion had to contend with. Chris Sawyer points out that Locomotion is an improvement over Transport Tycoon Deluxe in most areas, and comparing it to the original DOS release, I think, yeah, that is fair. You can build more interesting networks. You've got a bunch of elevated and underground options that you didn't have back in '94. The vehicle physics are much improved, and it's full of nice touches like the option to only play music appropriate to the era you're currently in. There's even a hidden Easter egg where you can drive the trains yourself. But if you were very into Transport Tycoon, you were not playing circa 1995 DOS TTD in 2004. The community by that point had two new main ways to get their junctions and jazz fix, both of them vastly improved. The first was TTD patch, which by this point was a mature extension running on top of the original executables, and yeah, I know I need to put out a video on this one because it's both interesting and a significant piece of Transport Tycoon history. But what you need to know here is that by 2004, TTD patch made running the game on modern Windows a much less ornery affair, offered increased vehicle limits, added mini quality of life features such as auto-replacing vehicles, had one of the best realistic vehicle physics options in the business, and most importantly, for what was quite an old game by this point, excellent support for replacing all kind of graphics through NewGraph. Yes, that originally came from TTD patch. The second option was the upstart OpenTTD, which in a few months had gone from merely a straight-up recreation to a significant improvement. While it didn't offer all of the functionality of TTD patch and threw some interesting bugs into the works in these early days, it did have its own user interface enhancements such as the AutoRail tool. The big killer features of large maps and new pathfinding wouldn't arrive until 2005, but at the point Locomotion released, OpenTTD 0.3 was already out and showing a lot of promise. Compared to this, where you could quickly build rail, clone vehicle orders in a couple of clicks and then have those vehicles obligingly replace themselves when they get old, Locomotion felt very limiting. You might think the lack of depots meant Chris Sawyer had given up on breakdowns and aging, two of the least popular features of Transport Tycoon, but oh no, trains will still get old and break down with increasing frequency, and you're expected to grub them up from the rails and replace any past its sell-by-date rolling stock yourself, one by one. I should note, that's deliberate. Chris Sawyer has mentioned in the past that one of the things he dislikes about the reverse-engineered versions of his games is they automate the micromanagement which is intended to be a significant late-game challenge and slow down your progress toward the end-game limits. And with characteristic just lack of respect for this pro-frustration viewpoint, the community had tools to edit Locomotion data files ready within a mere couple of weeks. Seriously, I was looking at some old forum posts. People got their first copies of the full game on 9th September, and Joseph Drexler, the author of TTD patch, announced his first tool to decode the data files on the 13th. The ability to encode XML files back into game objects by the 19th. Like 10 days and you're replacing stuff in the game. And by that point though, those forums were alight with the discussion you might expect from people who'd spent 10 years playing Transport Tycoon in various forms and been presented with this as the sequel. Was Locomotion any good? The sentiment was, unfortunately, negative. As you might expect, the most dedicated fans didn't care about the lack of 3D or per-pixel lighting. If anything, stubbornly sticking to 2D was seen as an asset, with no chance of the game being dumbed down to ease the load on a graphics card. But the interface, the lack of features that TTD patch and OpenTTD players had become used to, the lack of even vanilla Transport Tycoon Deluxe features such as monorail and maglev, and above all, the infuriatingly steep decline of vehicle reliability came up again and again. It wasn't unusual to see someone advertise their copy of Locomotion for sale, as they claimed. I'm giving up and going back to OpenTTD. Oh, if you ever bought like someone's second-hand forum copy of Locomotion and that was how you got this, please let me know. I want to see, like, did any of those adverts actually pay off in those sort of early internet days? Drexler's release thread for his Loco tool editor was swamped with people asking him to work some patch magic on the new game to fix all the problems that desperately needed fixing, despite many entreaties to keep things on topic and a few more concerned citizens pointing out that the end-user license agreement for Locomotion expressly forbade any kind of reverse engineering, unlike the earlier games. Being very familiar with the game also meant Transport Tycoon fans noticed many flaws had been carried over to Locomotion. The AI, it may have been more advanced to work with the freeform bridges, but it still squiggled tracks everywhere in a huge mess, and the classic Transport Tycoon failing of building so many stations at the same industry, each of them only got a trickle of cargo, was back, even down to the AIs competing directly with themselves. The pathfinding, yeah, it's claimed to be improved, but yeah, you'll still find ships just bashing their bows against tiny inlets in the coast and trains roaming everywhere in your network, apart from the one station you want them to go to, unless you set up extra waypoints in the route. Even the classic problem of a rather thin locomotive selection in the subtropical and subarctic climates reared its head again, with players noting that the US scenarios had a mere 10 locomotives to cover a century of transport history. But amongst all these threads of negativity, were a few people who stuck up for the game. They said that, hey, it did allow more interesting track layouts than Transport Tycoon. You could build elevated stations and subways, and the graphics engine was better, and it allowed for much more varied terrain, even if a lot of the things in it were brown. And this became better as custom scenarios and packs full of custom trains started to be released. The best scenarios solve a lot of Locomotion scale issues by making the game focus on one small situation. A single path through a large mountain range, a small island with only a few towns, or some other locale where the oversized trains and stations kind of make sense against the limited map size. This is the other side of being a 6 out of 10 game, because it's on these maps where I build a basic route, I start adding to it, and then I get completely lost in just expanding my network. There are so many options for snaking tracks around each other, building crossovers, or deciding how junctions will work, that you forget all the flaws as you build a monstrosity and then watch the trains flow through it. As the money starts to build up, you set yourself new challenges. Why shouldn't these towns have a subway system? Perhaps I should have built a station before expanding that city. But hey, I guess it's time for elevated rail if that's the problem. These are the moments where that Chris Sawyer magic starts coming through, and you get why he always used to refer to Locomotion as his proudest programming achievement, with some of his best and most creative code. As I say, I lost hundreds of hours to this back when it was new, until OpenTTD lured me away when large maps were first added. And making this video, it's been one of those games where I find myself just playing because I'm enjoying it, rather than grimacing through trying to assemble enough gameplay footage to cover for my hopelessly bloated scripts. And this is the curse hanging over Locomotion. It's a game that front-loads its flaws and holds back its good parts. I do not think that Transport Tycoon Deluxe is without its flaws. But those flaws, they tend to be mid or late game problems relating to vehicle management or pathfinding. Pathfinding really is everyone's favourite. You first fire it up and it hits you with the charm. You want to connect all those charming little houses and industries. Then, as you do, it hooks you with the scale. Yeah, you get the flaws also as you go into difficulty and you turn off breakdowns because they've been annoying you, and you sort of build all kinds of weird follies to handle the game's questionable pathfinding. But by that point, the scale's got you. You're hooked. Locomotion requires perseverance to get to the point that it starts to hook you in that way. You have to download a few mods or edit a few game files. You have to reject a few scenarios where the scale doesn't work or the AI just ruins your game instantly with spaghetti rails. And overall, you have to approach it with the idea that if you keep going through the painful bits, you will eventually reach a point where it clicks. And saying that, I think Locomotion's biggest problem is 2004. And this isn't the what the hell was 2004 thinking I posited earlier. 2004 was thinking Shrek 2 in the darkness. It had its thing. You do you, 2004. We didn't exist in a world where, our brains are constantly mashed towards inattention by infinitely scrolling short-form video and being trained to never think about a problem for longer than it takes to type it into the chat interface of a large language model. But also, 2004 wasn't 1994, where you bought a game or an album, and even if you didn't like it, you stuck with it in the hope it was a grower. 10 years later, games were cheaper, and if the shops had already shut for the day, you could pass the time by going online to complain about the lack of instant gratification. And one of the things which gets me thinking about my research for this is not just the speed with which Josef Drexler created the editing tools for Locomotion, but the speed with which people gave up on it. We're talking a couple of days with the game before people are listing everything wrong with Locomotion and why they won't be playing it anymore. I used to have to wait more days than that for an evening where nobody wanted to use the phone, and so I could run a cable down the stairs to discuss my games on Usenet. Locomotion is the last of its kind. It's an assembly language programmed 2D management game with palletized graphics that takes time to learn and appreciate. Released and marketed, for what little marketing Atari did, as an AA major publisher title. Yeah, I know that's a lot of qualifying points, and someone's probably going to quibble about whether AA really existed as an idea in 2004. Yet Sawyer's foreword to the manual even mentions how unusual this setup with a single developer and single artist was by the mid-2000s. In later years, he reflected that perhaps Locomotion was less of a success because in adding extra complexity, it lost something of the simplicity and accessibility of Transport Tycoon. And I do like that about Chris Sawyer. He's happy to be self-reflective in that way, admit that Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 had the better parks, and call himself stubborn. Even if he would probably hate the crimes I committed against his game design with my train sets. And again, I think the problem here is 2004. One of the things that I miss most from the 90s era of gaming is this idea of, hey, you bought the game, it's yours now. You do what you want with it. You edit it, blow open the files, hack your save, download all sorts of weird stuff from the internet that changes it in ways that developers have never thought of. It's all yours. And that modern idea, where games are so locked down you can have in-game content that sits on your hard drive rendered permanently inaccessible to you because you didn't play a time-limited event. Yeah, give me the days when you could fix that in 5 minutes with a hex editor. And 2004 was not that situation, but we were a step along the road with restrictive EULAs that scared people off breaking apart the game to figure out how it worked and release patches and improvements. One of the hardest things as a Locomotion player in 2005 was watching the huge strides in OpenTTD development and realising that Locomotion that was it. It's never going to get any better. Those flaws, they could never be fixed by some enterprising person with a lot of skill and a willingness to tear apart the game executable, the way that they had been for Transport Tycoon Deluxe. Yes, it seems wild that you've got this manual forward that calls out people still playing Transport Tycoon 10 years later, and then the game ships with a license preventing the very thing which made that happen. And when it came to people playing Locomotion 10 years later, Chris Sawyer kind of cheated. With the rising popularity of mobile games, his agent Jackie Lyons suggested that Locomotion's interface, while rather clunky on a PC with a mouse and keyboard, would be a tactile and enjoyable experience on mobile. So after some badgering, Sawyer got together with mobile developer Origin 8 to produce Transport Tycoon for Android and iOS. The game which released on mobile, called Transport Tycoon, it wasn't Transport Tycoon, it was Locomotion, more or less. Yeah, it's Locomotion. Yeah, touch controls, a few tweaks, a different name, but it's very much that. And yes, even knowing this, even with all of those negative reactions and things that I've just told you about, I still bought this game the moment I could, and I made many a long tube journey out to Hammersmith slightly more pleasurable by playing a simple scenario or two on my phone. And maybe calling it Locomotion with touch controls, it's a bit unfair. Yeah, a decent amount of work did go into this, including getting John Broomhall back with a live band to record versions of the 1994 game's classic jazz soundtrack. You do in that lose Locomotion's playlist for each era feature, but these are great, if, like the A-Team, you can find them. See, in a worrying portent for mobile game preservation, not only is this version effectively abandoned, Google's Play Store pretends it doesn't even exist. Yes, you can buy a 21-year-old Locomotion right now on multiple digital platforms and play it perfectly on a modern PC. But at half that age, the Android version is dead. I hear from people with iPhones and iPads that the iOS version isn't much better, with glitches and failures. Of course, if you are going to start playing Locomotion now, once you've obtained a legitimate copy of the original files, you'll want to install a little thing called OpenLoco. Yes, the thing we wished for back in the mid-2000s has finally happened. An offshoot of the OpenRTT2 project has grown into a recreation of the Locomotion game engine. Development is slow, but also steady, as modern-day Locomotion fans are a tiny niche compared to the hordes of OpenTTD and OpenRTT2 players. They've already added options for turning off breakdowns, removing the troublesome AI from scenarios where they just cause problems, adding custom vehicles to existing games, and a few user interface improvements here or there. It's not impossible to imagine future developments like OpenRTT2's new save format unlocking the larger maps and better terrain generation that Locomotion needs to solve its scale problem. And the charm? I'm never going to be able to claim that this looks beautiful and appealing from the moment you start it up, and I won't shed any tears for the originals if someone makes replacement industry graphics. But there is an odd sort of charm to Locomotion when you play it long enough, and you catch yourself watching your trains roll through wide curves next to a ploughed field. It's the last of its kind. It's a reflection almost of how Chris Sawyer describes himself. It's stubborn, but playful, and with a love of positive experiences where you spend your time building something up rather than tearing it down. While I opened this video by mentioning the average 6 out of 10 review score, there were a couple of outlier reviews from professional reviewers who loved this, and what made those reviews different was not that those reviewers didn't notice the flaws, because you'd be worried if someone who makes their money reviewing video games doesn't, but that they played through long enough to stop caring, to find that there is a satisfying and complex game with a lot of depth, waiting for those with a more 1990s style of patience. How do I cover something like that? It's not comedically bad. It's not an unimpeachably great game. It might be one that you love, or it might be one that you hate, based on how much the frustrations got to you, or how much the gameplay appealed to you once you found it. That's what I like about 6 out of 10 games, though. You could take 100 people and come away with 100 different reactions, ranging from my favourite game ever to the worst thing I ever played, and every one of those can be a valid and reasoned opinion, based on which part of the game they noticed more and noticed less. It's still pretty unsatisfying last part of the PC game story of the man who made two of my favourite ever games, though. And so, yeah, if you don't mind me, I'm dropping back a title to make a roller coaster which roller coasts off into the sunset and stays there.